All right, microschooling, that's our deep dive today.
Oh, yeah.
And whoa, you sent me articles, research, FAQs, really the work. So we've got a lot to cover.
It is a lot to cover, but it's a good time for it, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially after the pandemic, so many people are looking at education in a whole new light, really thinking, what could this look like? We're at this turning point.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah. Think of this as your crash course, Microschooling 101.
Yes.
And we're not just going to talk about what it is. We want to look at why it's become such a big deal. What's the hype? And could this be the future for your family? We've got some great resources for this deep dive. The Microschooling Review Briefing, their FAQ section, and an article from Scholars and Socials, The Rise of Microschools, a Revolution in Personalized Learning.
Fantastic. Between those, we have the basics and all the little details, even some expert opinions to think about.
Yeah. Okay, so first things first.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is a microschool? I picture this cute little building, maybe even a little red school bus with 4 seats.
Oh, that's a nice picture. But microschooling, it's funny, there's not just one definition. It's more like a philosophy than like a strict set of rules.
Oh, I see. So it's more about how you do it than like where you do it.
Yeah, one expert even said this. The key is that they resist definition. They may be public charter schools, public schools, microschools, private schools, homeschools. They are true pluralism in action.
That's interesting. So maybe instead of that tiny building I was picturing, it's more like a pop-up restaurant. Yeah, smaller, more experimental, yeah, for people with specific tastes.
That is a great analogy. You see so much variety in microschooling, it really fits. And actually, the National Microschooling Center, they divide it into 3 main types:
Okay.
independent, partnership, and provider networks.
Break those down for me. What are the differences?
Sure, independent ones, those are often run by families, maybe small groups of families just doing their own thing. Partnerships, they might work with already established schools or organizations. And then provider networks, that's basically a bunch of microschools sharing resources, supporting each other.
Gotcha, gotcha. But no matter what, the common thread seems to be it's more than one family. It's not just solo homeschooling. It's about building this small learning community.
Exactly. And that is a huge part of why families are drawn to it, especially after all the isolation of the pandemic.
Yeah, I can imagine if my kids had been stuck at home that long, I'd be wanting that kind of connection too. But is that the only reason for all this buzz around microschooling? Or is there something deeper at play?
The pandemic definitely sped things up, but our sources all point to one thing. People just aren't satisfied with traditional schools. That's the main driving force here. Actually, the Libertas Institute was pretty straightforward about it. They said the primary driver is dissatisfaction with conventional schooling. Parents are looking for alternatives. And that's where personalization comes in, that idea of really tailoring education to each kid's needs, letting them learn at their own pace. Our sources, they really emphasize that. That's what people are looking for.
And that makes sense with the whole micro concept, right?
Yeah.
Smaller classes, more one-on-one time with teachers. That seems like the perfect recipe for personalized learning.
The Libertas Institute had a really interesting point about this too. They said in this kind of setup, kids can really develop a love for learning because no one feels like they're falling behind. Imagine a classroom where everyone's moving at their own speed, focusing on what really interests them. The beauty of this smaller, more focused environment is that teachers can tap into what really motivates each student, whether it's project-based learning, real-world applications, or even just collaborating with peers who share their interests.
It's less about external pressure, more about finding what sparks that inner drive. I like that.
And speaking of sparks, here's another big thing our sources talked about: values alignment. For a lot of families, finding a school that matches their beliefs, their priorities, that's super important. You're finding a school that reflects your family's values.
So now that we have a better sense of what microschools are, why they're gaining traction, let's dive into the actual benefits. Beyond the smaller classes, the personalized learning, what else is there?
Our sources highlight some really great advantages. We've talked about the individualized attention, the close-knit community, and of course, how learning can be tailored to each child.
And I imagine there's less bullying too in a smaller setting. You mentioned earlier that no child feels behind in a microschool. But doesn't that lack of competition, those traditional benchmarks, doesn't that make it harder for kids to stay motivated? There's no pressure to be at the top of the class.
It's a valid point, and definitely something microschools have to be mindful of. But many who support this model argue that this smaller, more intimate setting actually allows for a different kind of motivation.
Let's talk practicality for a second. What about the cost? Private schooling can be a huge financial burden. Are microschools any different?
That's a crucial question. The good news is that microschools can be way more affordable than many private schools. The Libertas Institute found that almost 75% of microschools have tuition that is less than $10,000. 30% have one that is less than $5,000.
Wow, that is a big difference. But I'm guessing costs can vary depending on the type of microschool, what they offer. What about financial aid? Are there programs to help families who might not be able to afford even those lower tuition rates?
Absolutely. That's where education savings accounts, or ESAs, come into play. These are government-funded programs that let parents use a portion of their child's education funding for a wider range of expenses, including microschool tuition.
So basically, instead of that money going straight to a public school, parents can choose to direct it towards alternatives like microschools. That's fantastic. It really opens up possibilities for families who might not have considered this option before.
It does. However, it is important to note that funding varies from state to state. Some programs might have eligibility requirements as well, so it's always best to research what's available in your specific area.
Good point. So it sounds like microschooling has a lot going for it. Personalized learning, smaller communities, potential cost savings, and even funding options like ESAs. But no educational model is perfect, right? What are some of the challenges, maybe some downsides we should be aware of?
You're right, there's no such thing as a perfect system, and one issue that comes up a lot in our research is the regulatory landscape. Microschooling is relatively new, and it's changing so rapidly that the rules and oversight can be a bit unclear.
Is there a worry about quality control, a lack of accountability? I love the idea of less bureaucracy, more freedom to innovate, but we do need some safeguards, right?
Absolutely, and that's where things get tricky. How do we balance fostering innovation with ensuring quality? The NCSL source actually quoted an expert who warned against stifling innovation with too much regulation. He said, "What microschools need most is freedom from regulatory burdens at local levels that make it impossible for them to start."
So too much regulation could actually hurt the movement before it even gets going.
Exactly. But at the same time, some level of oversight is needed to protect students to make sure microschools are meeting certain standards. It's a fine line to walk.
And another challenge I can imagine is how do you measure success in a system that's so individualized? If we're not using standardized tests, then what? How do you evaluate a system that's all about personalized learning paths and diverse outcomes?
That's a great question and a vital one. How do you evaluate something that's so decentralized and tailored to individual needs? Our sources suggest looking at alternative metrics, things like student engagement, long-term outcomes, and the overall sustainability of the microschool.
So instead of focusing solely on test scores, we should consider things like, are students happy? Are they able to apply what they've learned in the real world? And is the microschool itself thriving, meeting the needs of its community?
Precisely. It's about moving away from standardized metrics to more holistic, individualized assessments that reflect the unique goals and values of each microschool and its students.
It makes sense, but it also sounds much more complex, more nuanced than just looking at a test score. That could be tough to implement on a larger scale.
It definitely is, and it's important to remember this is still a young, evolving field. We need more research to figure out the most effective ways to measure success in a microschooling context.
That's a good point. It's exciting to see this kind of experimentation in education, but we need to be realistic about the challenges and acknowledge that we still have a lot to learn.
Absolutely, and that brings us to another key point. Microschooling is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It won't be right for every family, for every child.
It's one option among many. Families need to carefully consider, does this align with our values, with our child's learning style, and our overall educational goals? Imagine if this microschooling thing really takes off. What could that mean? How could it change the way we think about education,
Ooh, it's a big question.
about community, even work-life balance? It feels like we're on the brink of something huge.
It really is exciting to think about. Imagine a world where education is truly personalized, where learning doesn't just happen in a classroom, but in homes, community centers, online. Think about the communities, microschools, they could become these vibrant hubs, people of all ages connecting, learning from each other, strengthening those local ties. It's almost like going back to that village model where everyone's involved in raising the next generation.
I love that. It's so much bigger than just academics. It's about belonging, purpose, being connected to your community.
It is. And of course, we can't forget about work-life balance. Microschools often have flexible schedules, structures. That can be a game changer for working parents.
It could be the answer to balancing work and family. Imagine being more involved in your child's education without having to give up your career goals.
Exactly. So you see, the impact of widespread microschooling, it could be really profound. It touches individual learning, community dynamics, even the structure of our society.
It's like a chain reaction, leading to a future that's more adaptable, more responsive, more human-centered. It's inspiring, but also a little scary. Are we ready for such a radical shift in how we think about education?
That is the question, isn't it? Change can be tough, but it can also be incredibly freeing. Look, microschooling isn't a magic solution. It won't work for everybody, But it is a powerful experiment. It shows a willingness to question the way things are, to explore new possibilities.
So for our listeners who've been with us this whole time, soaking it all in, what's the takeaway? What should they do with all this new knowledge about microschooling?
The most important thing, stay curious. This movement is always changing, so keep learning, keep asking questions, stay engaged.
Yeah,
The National Microschooling Center, their website is a fantastic resource.
I was just going to say that. They have so much information on different models, stories from real microschoolers, even resources for people who are thinking about starting their own microschool.
It's the perfect place to start for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this world.
Absolutely. So if you're intrigued by what you've heard today, go check it out. And that's it for our deep dive into microschooling. We hope you found it informative, inspiring. If you want to keep the conversation going, head over to the National Microschooling Center's website. Happy learning.